this edition of Hebrew Nation News on YouTube. At Hebrew Nation News, we bring you news that is not found in the mainstream media. We look at the facts on the ground in the news and then connect those facts back to the scriptures. Always asking the question, what time is it? We don't give just the facts, but we also ask the question, what does it mean? This is your intelligence brief for the week. Reporting to you live on YouTube, this is Laura Densmore with Hebrew Nation News. Welcome, YouTube listeners, to this HNR YouTube report, and we see rioting and violence raging and roaring and out of control in Charlotte, Louisiana. What got the whole thing started? Take a look at this news report that tells us more of the information. I'm looking at The Guardian. Keith Scott shooting. Charlotte police say they warned him to drop the handgun. So this was a black gentleman who had an outstanding warrant for his arrest, and he was armed with a handgun, and a black police officer who shot him. So there were repeated, numerous clear warnings that were given to him to drop his handgun before he was fatally shot. Now, this is a statement coming from Care Putney, the Charlotte police chief, and he said that officers were searching for a suspect on Tuesday when they saw a 43-year-old Keith Lamont Scott exit a vehicle with a handgun and mistook him for a wanted man. He said the officers told Scott, who was black, to drop his gun and that he got out of the vehicle a second time, still carrying the gun. He said the man was shot because he potentially posed a threat, but added that it was unclear whether he at any point pointed the weapon at the police. A weapon was recovered by detectives at the scene. But of course, the mainstream media, the social media, got a hold of the story and decided to change the narrative and tell a fairy tale. And so what began to get out there through the Twitter and through Facebook was that it was a black unarmed man who was shot by a white police officer. And of course, that's what got the demonstrations, the race rioting and the violence really raging in Charlotte. In another news story coming from InfoWars, we have this story. Eyewitness photographs show Keith Scott handgun during the Charlotte police shooting. And Putney said that officers gave repeated verbal commands for Scott to drop his handgun. A Charlotte police officer shot and killed an armed man by the name of Keith Scott at an apartment complex while executing an arrest warrant. And so he was armed, and Putney said that the officers gave repeated verbal commands for Scott to drop his handgun. He said that Scott posed a threat to the officers, and there's actually a photo out there from the scene of the shooting that shows a gun on the ground near Scott's feet as officers stood around him. But of course, with the social media, once they got a hold of the story, they twisted it, told a fairy tale, said it was a white police officer shooting a black unarmed man, and that's what got the race rioting and war and violence going. Now, you take this fairy tale and elevate it to yet another level, and the mainstream media is calling these the violence and the rioting, they're calling it peaceful protests. Take a listen to this clip.
Yeah, there were still very big crowds, but none of the violence that we saw on Tuesday or Wednesday nights. It was a mostly peaceful demonstration, thanks in large part to the hundreds of National Guard troops and state police who provided extra protection to the hotels and banks and other key locations in the Uptown Business District, helping Charlotte police keep the peace. At one point, demonstrators rushed onto a stretch of the highway, I-277, to try and disrupt traffic, and police did use tear gas to disperse that crowd, and two officers reportedly suffered injuries to their eyes when sprayed by some kind of chemical agent. But by 2 a.m., the streets were mostly empty and very, very calm, unlike the nights past, and businesses...
It's generally peaceful. Every once in a while, people will stop to taunt the police or taunt the National Guard when they're standing around. But just as often, I've seen people reach out and shake hands with them and tell them they appreciated them being out here.
This is a peaceful protest. Nobody wants anything. They say they just want to be left alone, the peaceful protesters and the National Guard. Everybody just wants to go home.
We get to a street where there's a cruiser or a group of police officers on bikes blocking the way. It's generally orderly. It's mostly officers on bicycles. There's an occasional cruiser. There are little groups of National Guardsmen, 2 or 3 at a time. They're standing in front of a lot of the bank buildings and the hotels, some of which suffered some damage the other night in the protest. Earlier in the evening during a march, I saw some police in riot gear with the shields and everything.
And now that you've seen that fairy tale coming from the lamestream about the spin and the narrative that they're feeding for you to consume, let's find out what the real truth is with facts on the ground. We're going to go to listen to Paul Joseph Watson from InfoWars. Give it a listen.
Activists staged a peaceful protest in Charlotte last night, but were brutally tear-gassed by racist cops. Oh, wait a second. Physically attacking reporters is not a legitimate form of protest. Shooting each other is not a legitimate form of protest. Stealing and looting cash registers from local businesses is not a legitimate form of protest. Trying to set journalists on fire is not a legitimate form of protest. Throwing rocks off bridges at passing vehicles full of families is not a legitimate form of protest. Beating up innocent people in underground parking lots because they're white is not a legitimate form of protest. Smashing up apartment windows where black people live to protest in favour of Black Lives Matter is not a legitimate form of protest. Smashing up buses that poor black people rely on to get to their jobs is not a legitimate form of protest. Looting the Charlotte Hornets team store so you can steal basketball merchandise is not a legitimate form of protest. Stealing sneakers is not a legitimate form of protest. Attempting to hijack cars and terrify their innocent occupants is not a legitimate form of protest. But how did MSNBC report on all this? By calling the rioters peaceful.
The people that are out here protesting, they're hugging and they're like, they're being very peaceful.
We were following this crowd that was largely peaceful.
Mostly peaceful. We've also seen some sweet scenes of protesters hugging one another and praying. Mostly a group of peaceful protesters. Peaceful, 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 peaceful.
And that's why 94% of Americans don't trust the mainstream media. What's unfolding in Charlotte is objectively, manifestly, provably not a protest. It's a violent, unjustified riot by criminals, gang members, and thugs. Why?
There you have it. Why is the mainstream media spinning a narrative and telling a fairy tale that the riots and the violence in Charlotte is actually peaceful demonstrations? And why are these riots going on? Why did this even get going in the first place? When it was a black police officer shooting a black armed man who had a warrant out for his arrest. Well, there's an ulterior agenda. Often George Soros is behind these kind of things where he actually has paid protesters paid to go and stir the pot and to create violence and unrest on the streets. And, you know, it wouldn't surprise me if they try to get a race riot going on and cause it to spread. And then when it gets really out of control, then the guy who occupies the Oval Office would then declare martial law and cancel or suspend the presidential elections. Karl Marx once said, never waste a good crisis. So we urge calm and peacefulness in the streets, and we urge people to get up on the wall and pray for the peace in the streets of Charlotte, and that people would be based upon reason and logic and facts, and not on lies from the mainstream media spin and fairy tales that they are dishing out to the public. There you have it. Thanks for listening and watching HNR YouTube Report.